Sarah Martinez had always believed that love would conquer everything. At 28, she worked as a nurse at the local hospital, spending her days caring for others while her own heart slowly broke apart. Her husband of 5 years, Marcus, had become a stranger living in the same house. What started as small arguments about money and time had grown into cold silences that stretched for days. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday evening in October. Sarah arrived home after a 12-hour shift to find Marcus packing his clothes into black garbage bags. No explanation, no discussion, just the sound of zippers and the rustle of plastic. When she asked what was happening, he barely looked up. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah. I'm done pretending everything is fine," Marcus said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I've been staying at my brother's place for the past week. I just came back to get my things." Sarah felt the room spin around her. "What do you mean you've been staying there? You told me you were working late shifts." "We can work this out, Marcus. We can go to counseling, There's someone else," he interrupted, finally meeting her eyes. "I didn't plan for it to happen, but it did. Lisa understands me in ways you never could." Lisa, her best friend since college. The woman who had been maid of honor at their wedding. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank onto the couch they had picked out together during happier times. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound she had ever treated. Within 2 hours, Marcus was gone. He took half of everything, including their joint savings account, leaving Sarah with a mortgage she couldn't afford on her nurse's salary alone. The house that once felt like home now echoed with emptiness. Every corner held memories that now felt like lies. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of pain and disbelief. Sarah called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't even cry anymore. Her sister Rachel tried to help, bringing groceries and sitting with her for hours, but Sarah had retreated so far into herself that she barely acknowledged the support. The divorce papers arrived on a Friday morning, delivered by a courier who seemed apologetic about his job. Sarah stared at the legal documents, seeing her marriage reduced to property divisions and custody arrangements for pets they didn't even have. Marcus wanted everything settled quickly and quietly. No fuss, no drama. Just a clean break from the woman he had promised to love forever. Sarah's world had completely collapsed. She lost her home when the bank started foreclosure proceedings. Her credit was ruined because Marcus had secretly maxed out credit cards she didn't know about. Even her job became difficult to maintain as her emotional state affected her ability to care for patients with the compassion they deserved. 6 months after Marcus left, Sarah found herself living in a small studio apartment above a laundromat, working part-time at a clinic because she couldn't handle full-time responsibilities. Her reflection in the mirror showed a hollow version of who she used to be. Dark circles under her eyes, weight loss that made her clothes hang loose, and a sadness that seemed permanent. The worst part wasn't the financial struggle or even the loneliness. It was the complete loss of identity. Sarah had defined herself as Marcus's wife, as part of a team, as someone building a future with another person. Now she was just Sarah, and she had forgotten who that person was supposed to be. Her friends had tried to stay in touch at first, but Sarah's depression had pushed most of them away. She declined invitations, didn't return calls, and eventually, people stopped reaching out. The isolation became a prison of her own making. But she felt too broken to find the key. One evening, while sorting through old photos she had avoided looking at, Sarah found a picture from her nursing school graduation. The young woman in the photo looked confident and hopeful, ready to take on the world and make a difference. Sarah barely recognized herself. Where had that person gone? When had she allowed someone else's choices to define her entire existence? That night, for the first time in months, Sarah cried. Not the quiet tears of self-pity she had shed before, but deep, cleansing sobs that came from somewhere she had locked away. She cried for the woman she used to be, for the dreams that had died with her marriage, and for the time she had wasted believing that someone else could complete her. As the sun rose the next morning, something shifted inside Sarah. The pain was still there, but underneath it, she felt a tiny spark of something she had almost forgotten existed. It wasn't hope exactly, but it wasn't complete despair either. It was the beginning of a realization that she was still alive, still breathing, and maybe that meant something. Sarah didn't know it yet. But this moment would mark the beginning of the most challenging and transformative journey of her life. The broken woman sitting in that cramped apartment above the laundromat was about to discover strength she never knew she possessed. But first she would have to learn to fight for herself in ways she never imagined necessary. Sarah's decision to rebuild her life started with small, almost invisible steps. She began by cleaning her tiny apartment, scrubbing away months of neglect and despair. The physical act of organizing her space seemed to organize something inside her mind as well. She threw away old takeout containers, washed clothes that had been piling up, and for the first time in months, bought fresh flowers for her windowsill. The real challenge came when she tried to return to full-time work. Dr. Patricia Williams, the head of the emergency department where Sarah used to work, welcomed her back with open arms but made it clear that Sarah would need to prove herself again. The months of absence had created doubt about her reliability, and Sarah could see the question in her colleagues' eyes. Would she break down again when things got tough? Sarah's first week back was brutal. Her hands shook when she started IVs, and she found herself getting overwhelmed by situations that used to be routine. During a particularly busy Friday night, a car accident victim came in screaming in pain and Sarah froze. The sound reminded her of her own internal screaming during those dark months, and she had to step away to collect herself. But instead of giving up, Sarah made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. She enrolled in trauma counseling, not just to deal with patient care, but to face her own emotional wounds. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, her therapist, was a no-nonsense woman who didn't let Sarah hide behind excuses or self-pity. "You're not the first woman to be betrayed, and you won't be the last," Dr. Hayes said during their third session. "The question is, are you going to let someone else's choices define the rest of your life, or are you going to write your own story?" The counseling sessions were like surgery without anesthesia. Sarah had to examine every aspect of her failed marriage, acknowledge her own role in its problems, and confront the fact that she had lost herself long before Marcus left. She had spent years trying to be the perfect wife, sacrificing her own dreams and interests to support his goals. One breakthrough came when Dr. Hayes asked Sarah to make a list of things she had wanted to do before she got married. Sarah realized she couldn't remember having personal ambitions beyond being a good wife and mother. She had been so focused on fitting into someone else's life plan that she had never developed her own. This realization led Sarah to make a radical decision. She applied for a specialized training program in emergency trauma nursing that would require her to travel to different hospitals and learn advanced techniques. The program was competitive and demanding, exactly the kind of challenge the old Sarah would have avoided, because it might interfere with her husband's schedule. When Sarah told her sister Rachel about the program, Rachel was both excited and worried. "Are you sure you're ready for something this intense? It's only been 8 months since the divorce. Maybe you should take things slower." But Sarah had made up her mind. "I've been taking things slow my whole life, Rachel. I played it safe, made myself small, and tried to be what everyone else wanted me to be. Look where that got me. I need to find out who I really am when I'm not trying to please someone else." The application process was rigorous. Sarah had to submit her academic records, get recommendations from supervisors, and write an essay about her career goals. For the first time in years, she found herself excited about the future, instead of just trying to survive each day. While waiting to hear about the program, Sarah began making other changes. She started running in the morning, something she had given up because Marcus said it was a waste of time. She reconnected with old friends from nursing school who had moved to different cities. She even took a weekend trip by herself to visit her grandmother, something she hadn't done in 3 years. The biggest test came when Marcus called her unexpectedly one evening. His voice was different, uncertain, and perhaps regretful. "Sarah, I've been thinking about us lately. Maybe we ended things too quickly. Lisa and I are having problems, and I keep remembering the good times we had." 6 months earlier, Sarah would have broken down crying and begged him to come back. But the woman who answered the phone that night was not the same person he had left. "Marcus, I appreciate you calling, but I'm not interested in revisiting our marriage. I hope you work things out with Lisa, and I hope you find happiness, but my life is moving in a different direction now." After she hung up, Sarah felt a strange combination of sadness and triumph. She mourned the final death of her old dreams but celebrated the birth of new ones. The conversation proved to her that she was truly healing, that the broken woman who had lived above the laundromat was transforming into someone stronger. 2 weeks later, Sarah received the call she had been waiting for. She had been accepted into the trauma nursing program. The director, Dr. Michael Chen, explained that the program would take her to emergency departments in major cities, disaster zones, and even international medical missions. It would be demanding, sometimes dangerous work that required complete dedication. "I have to ask you directly, Ms. Martinez," Dr. Chen said during their phone conversation. "This program has a high dropout rate because of the physical and emotional demands. Are you prepared for that level of challenge?" Sarah looked around her small apartment, thinking about how far she had come from the broken woman who once couldn't get out of bed. "Dr. Chen, I've already been through hell. This feels like my chance to turn that experience into something meaningful. I'm not just prepared for the challenge, I'm hungry for it." As she packed her belongings for the first assignment in Chicago, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about her future. She wasn't running away from her past anymore. She was running toward something better. The transformation was far from complete, but Sarah was no longer the forgotten woman who had lost herself in someone else's life. She was becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Chicago's emergency department at County General was like nothing Sarah had ever experienced. The pace was relentless, the cases more severe, and the pressure constant. Within her first week, she had treated 3 gunshot victims, helped deliver a baby in the ambulance bay, and worked through a multi-car accident that brought in 12 patients simultaneously. Dr. Robert Harrison, the emergency department chief, was known for breaking new nurses within their first month. He was demanding, critical, and had zero tolerance for weakness. When Sarah was assigned to work directly under his supervision, the other nurses looked at her with pity. "Martinez, you're with me," Dr. Harrison barked during Sarah's second week. "We've got a building collapse downtown, multiple casualties coming in, and I need someone who won't fall apart when things get ugly." The next 6 hours tested every skill Sarah had ever learned, and several she had to invent on the spot. Victims arrived covered in dust and debris, some with injuries so severe that quick decisions meant the difference between life and death. Sarah found herself leading triage, coordinating with paramedics, and somehow keeping track of 15 critical patients at once. During the chaos, a young girl around 8 years old was brought in unconscious. Her parents nowhere to be found. Sarah stayed with her throughout the night, monitoring her condition while managing other patients. When the girl finally woke up scared and alone, Sarah was there to hold her hand and promise that everything would be okay. Dr. Harrison watched Sarah throughout the crisis. At the end of the shift, he pulled her aside. "I've been doing this for 20 years, Martinez. I've seen nurses crack under pressure, freeze up when lives are on the line, or simply give up when things get too hard. You didn't do any of those things tonight. Thank you, Dr. Harrison. I just did what needed to be done." "That's exactly my point," he said, studying her with new respect. "Most people can't access that level of focus under extreme pressure. Whatever you went through before this program, it prepared you for something important." Sarah's reputation began to spread throughout the hospital. She had a calmness in emergencies that came from having survived her own personal disaster. When other nurses started to panic, Sarah became steadier. When situations seemed hopeless, she found solutions that others missed. The real test came during her 3rd month in Chicago, when the program director received a special request. A humanitarian organization needed experienced trauma nurses for a medical mission in a conflict zone. The assignment was voluntary, dangerous, and would require working in conditions that most medical professionals would find impossible. Dr. Chen called Sarah personally. "I've had requests for you specifically from several hospitals, but this is different. It's a refugee camp on the border of a war zone. Medical supplies are limited, security is questionable, and you'd be treating casualties of war. I have to be honest, some nurses come back from missions like this changed forever." Sarah didn't hesitate. "When do I leave?" 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself in a canvas tent that served as a hospital, treating wounds caused by weapons she had only read about in textbooks. The refugees had been fleeing their homes for months, arriving at the camp with injuries, diseases, and trauma that went far beyond the physical. Her team consisted of 2 doctors, 3 nurses, and a translator named Ahmed who became her lifeline in understanding not just the language but the culture and context of their patients' suffering. The work was 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, with medical supplies that had to be rationed and equipment that barely functioned. On her 4th day, A family arrived at the camp after walking for 3 weeks to escape bombing in their village. The mother had been shot in the leg and was badly infected. The father carried his 5-year-old son who had been injured by shrapnel. Their teenage daughter walked beside them, her eyes vacant with trauma. Sarah worked on the mother for 6 hours, cleaning the wound, fighting the infection, and stabilizing her condition. The little boy needed surgery that their makeshift hospital couldn't provide, so Sarah coordinated with a medical transport to get him to a proper facility 50 miles away. But it was the teenage girl, Amira, who affected Sarah most deeply. Amira spoke enough English to communicate, and Sarah learned that she had been a top student in her school, dreaming of becoming a doctor herself before the war destroyed everything she knew. Now she took care of her injured family, while dealing with her own physical and emotional wounds. "I used to have plans," Amira told Sarah one evening as they sat outside the medical tent. "I was going to study medicine in the capital city. I had books, teachers who believed in me, a future that made sense. Now I don't even know if my home still exists." Sarah saw herself in this brave young woman, someone whose life had been shattered by circumstances beyond her control, who had lost her identity and her dreams. But she also saw something else, incredible strength that Amira didn't even recognize in herself. "You're still going to be a doctor," Sarah told her. "Maybe not in the way you originally planned, and maybe not as quickly as you hoped, but you're going to find a way. I can see it in how you care for your family, how you help translate for other patients, how you keep going when everything seems impossible." Over the following weeks, Sarah became a mentor to Amira, teaching her basic medical skills and helping her understand that her dreams weren't dead, just temporarily redirected. In doing so, Sarah discovered something profound about her own journey. All the pain she had experienced, all the nights of feeling broken and forgotten, had been preparing her for this moment. Her personal disaster had taught her how to function when everything fell apart. Her journey back from rock bottom had given her the skills to help others do the same. 1 month into the mission, the camp came under attack. Sarah found herself treating wounded civilians while explosions echoed in the distance, and medical staff had to be ready to evacuate at a moment's notice. In those terrifying hours, Sarah discovered that she had become someone she never imagined possible. A person who could provide healing and hope even in the middle of hell. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the mission's medical director, observed Sarah during the crisis. "You know, Sarah, most people come on these missions to help others, and that's admirable, but you're doing something different. You're transforming trauma into strength, both for yourself and everyone around you. That's a rare gift." As Sarah treated patients by candlelight with the sound of distant gunfire in the background, she realized that the broken woman who had sat in that studio apartment a year ago was completely gone. In her place was someone who had discovered that the deepest wounds could become sources of the greatest strength, if a person was willing to do the hard work of healing. The attack on the refugee camp changed everything for Sarah. What started as distant explosions became a direct assault that forced the entire medical team to work while preparing for immediate evacuation. Sarah found herself treating a 7-year-old boy with shrapnel wounds while helicopters circled overhead, and armed soldiers took positions around the medical tent. In the chaos, the camp's communication systems were destroyed. The medical team was cut off from their base organization, unsure when or if evacuation would come. Dr. Rodriguez made the difficult decision to continue treating patients while preparing to move the most critical cases to a safer location. Sarah volunteered to stay behind with the patients who couldn't be moved. It was the kind of decision that a year ago would have been impossible for her to make. The old Sarah would have looked for someone else to take the risk, someone braver or more qualified. But the woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing understood that sometimes the most important moments in life require choosing courage over safety. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Dr. Rodriguez asked Sarah privately. "We're talking about potentially being trapped here with limited supplies and no backup support. The soldiers can't guarantee your safety." Sarah looked around the medical tent at the patients depending on her care. Among them was Amira's little brother, still recovering from his surgery, and an elderly woman who reminded Sarah of her own grandmother. "These people trusted us to help them. I can't abandon them now just because things got dangerous." For 3 days, Sarah and Ahmed worked alone in the camp while sporadic fighting continued around them. They had enough medical supplies for maybe one more day, no way to call for help, and patients who needed care that went beyond their basic capabilities. The stress was overwhelming, but Sarah discovered something remarkable. The worse things got, the clearer her thinking became. On the second night, while treating an infected wound by flashlight, Sarah realized she was experiencing something she had never felt before: complete confidence in her own abilities. Not the fake confidence she had tried to project during her marriage, but genuine trust in her skills and judgment. She was making life and death decisions without second-guessing herself, managing crises without falling apart, and somehow finding solutions that she didn't even know she possessed. When rescue finally came, Sarah had successfully treated 15 critical patients with minimal supplies and no backup support. The evacuation team was amazed to find all patients stable and the medical operations running smoothly despite the impossible conditions. Captain Maria Santos, the military officer leading the rescue operation, pulled Sarah aside. "I've coordinated dozens of these evacuations, and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished here. Most medical professionals would have cracked under this kind of pressure. Where did you learn to handle extreme situations like this?" Sarah thought about the question as she helped load patients onto transport vehicles. "I learned it by surviving the worst thing that ever happened to me. When you've already lost everything that mattered and found a way to keep going, external dangers don't seem as scary." The mission ended earlier than planned due to the security situation, but Sarah's 3 months in the field had transformed her completely. She returned to the United States with recommendations from every supervisor she had worked with, and job offers from hospitals across the country. More importantly, she returned with something she had never possessed before: an unshakable sense of her own identity and worth. The woman who stepped off the plane was confident without being arrogant, strong without being hard, and compassionate without being weak. Dr. Chen met Sarah at the airport, curious to hear about her experiences, but also concerned about how the traumatic mission might have affected her. He had seen other nurses return from similar assignments struggling with PTSD or burnout. "How are you handling the transition back?" he asked during their debriefing. "Missions like that can be psychologically difficult to process." Sarah smiled, and Dr. Chen noticed that her entire demeanor had changed. She carried herself differently, spoke with more authority, and seemed to possess a calm confidence that hadn't been there before. "Dr. Chen, I know this might sound strange, but I think I found myself in that refugee camp. All the chaos and danger and impossible situations, it felt like I was finally doing what I was meant to do. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to be someone else or live up to someone else's expectations. I was just being me, and that was enough." The job offers started coming immediately. Emergency departments in major cities wanted Sarah specifically, having heard about her performance under extreme conditions. But the offer that interested her most came from an unexpected source. The International Emergency Medical Corps wanted her to lead a team developing training programs for nurses working in crisis situations. The position would involve traveling to different disaster zones, training medical personnel, and developing protocols for emergency care in extreme conditions. It was demanding, sometimes dangerous work that would require her to be away from home for months at a time. The old Sarah would have worried about how such a career would affect her chances of finding another husband and settling down. But Sarah's priorities had completely shifted. She was no longer looking for someone to complete her, because she had finally become complete on her own. The broken woman who had defined herself through her relationship with Marcus was gone, replaced by someone who knew exactly who she was and what she could accomplish. When Sarah called her sister Rachel to discuss the job offer, Rachel was both impressed and concerned. "It sounds amazing, Sarah, and I can hear how excited you are about it. But aren't you worried about being alone? Don't you want to find someone new and maybe have a family?" Sarah had thought about this question many times during her journey back to herself. "Rachel, I spent years trying to build a life with someone who didn't really see me or value what I could offer. Now I'm building a life that feels authentic and meaningful. If I meet someone who appreciates the person I've become and wants to share this kind of life, that would be wonderful. But I'm never again going to make myself smaller or change my dreams to fit someone else's vision." 3 weeks later, Sarah accepted the position with the International Emergency Medical Corps. Her first assignment would be developing training programs for medical personnel working in earthquake disaster zones. It would require her to travel to areas where the infrastructure was destroyed and resources were limited. Exactly the kind of challenge that would have terrified the old Sarah, but now excited the woman she had become. As she packed for her new role, Sarah looked through old photos from her marriage and felt something she hadn't expected: gratitude. Marcus's betrayal had been devastating at the time, but it had also freed her from a life that was never really hers. If he hadn't left, she might have spent the rest of her life trying to be someone she wasn't, never discovering the strength and capabilities that had been inside her all along. The woman preparing for her next adventure was someone Marcus would barely recognize. But more importantly, she was someone Sarah herself was proud to be. Sarah's first assignment with the International Emergency Medical Corps took her to a mountain region that had been devastated by a massive earthquake. Entire villages had been destroyed. Roads were impassable, and the few medical facilities that survived were overwhelmed with casualties. Her job was to establish a training center for local medical personnel and volunteers who were struggling to provide care with limited resources. The helicopter dropped Sarah and her supply team at a makeshift landing zone surrounded by rubble that used to be a town of 12,000 people. The destruction was more complete than anything she had seen during her refugee camp mission. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, Sarah felt energized. This was exactly the kind of challenge she had discovered she was built for. Within hours of arriving, Sarah had assessed the medical needs, identified the most experienced local personnel, and begun organizing a training program that could function without electricity, running water, or proper medical equipment. She worked with Dr. James Wright, a veteran emergency physician, and Isabella Costa, a logistics coordinator who had been managing disaster relief for 15 years. "I have to admit," Dr. Wright told Sarah after their first week, "I was skeptical about bringing someone so young to lead this operation. But you're organizing chaos better than people who've been doing this work for decades. How did you develop these skills so quickly?" Sarah was setting up a training session on wound care, using supplies salvaged from the destroyed hospital. "Dr. Wright, I think surviving personal disaster prepared me for this kind of work better than any textbook could. When you've had to rebuild your entire life from nothing, organizing disaster relief feels familiar." The training program Sarah developed became a model that would later be used in disaster zones around the world. She created simple, practical protocols that could be implemented by people with minimal medical training, using whatever supplies were available. More importantly, she understood how to keep people functioning under extreme stress because she had learned to do it herself. 3 months into the assignment, Sarah received a message that shocked her completely. The message was from Amira, the teenage refugee she had mentored. Amira had somehow tracked down Sarah's contact information to share incredible news. She had been accepted into a medical scholarship program that would allow her to study nursing in Germany. "Miss Sarah," Amira wrote, "you told me I would still become a doctor, and I never forgot those words. When everything seemed impossible, I remembered how you kept working even when the camp was being attacked. You showed me that dreams don't die unless we let them. I start my studies next month, and I wanted you to know that you saved more than my mother's life that day. You saved my future too." Reading Amira's message, Sarah realized that her journey had come full circle in a way she never could have planned. The pain that had nearly destroyed her had been transformed into the ability to give others hope when their worlds fell apart. She was no longer just surviving her own crisis. She was helping others overcome theirs. The success of Sarah's training program caught the attention of international relief organizations, and job offers began arriving from around the world. The United Nations wanted her to develop emergency medical protocols for refugee situations. The World Health Organization offered her a position coordinating disaster response training across multiple countries. But the offer that intrigued Sarah most came from Dr. Patricia Williams, her former supervisor from the hospital where she had worked before her marriage fell apart. Dr. Williams wanted Sarah to return and establish a new emergency preparedness program that would train medical personnel for both natural disasters and mass casualty events. "Sarah, I know we lost touch after your divorce, and I regret not doing more to support you during that difficult time," Dr. Williams said during their phone conversation. "But I've been following your career, and what you've accomplished is remarkable. More than that, you've become the kind of leader we desperately need in emergency medicine." The position would allow Sarah to stay in one place while still doing the work she loved. She would travel periodically for training missions, But she would also have a home base and the opportunity to build lasting relationships with colleagues and friends. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah seriously considered settling down somewhere permanently, but her definition of settling down had changed completely. Instead of looking for security through a relationship, she was thinking about how to build a life that felt meaningful and sustainable, while still allowing her to grow and take on new challenges. As Sarah considered her options, she received an unexpected visitor at the disaster site. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the mission director from her refugee camp experience, had flown in to observe the training program Sarah had developed. "I had to see this for myself," Dr. Rodriguez explained, as she watched Sarah lead a group of local volunteers through a simulation exercise. "The reports I've been getting about your work here are extraordinary. You're not just training people in medical procedures. You're teaching them how to maintain hope and focus when everything around them is falling apart." Dr. Rodriguez spent 3 days observing Sarah's program, and what she saw impressed her more than the technical training. Sarah had created an environment where people felt capable and confident, even in the face of overwhelming challenges. She had somehow turned disaster response into a source of empowerment, rather than just crisis management. "You know what makes you different from other disaster relief coordinators I've worked with?" Dr. Rodriguez asked Sarah on her last evening at the site. "Most people come to this work to help others, which is admirable. But you understand something deeper. You know that people are capable of incredible strength when someone believes in them and gives them the tools they need." That conversation helped Sarah make her decision about her future. She accepted Dr. Williams's offer to return home, but with conditions. She wanted to continue her international work on a part-time basis, and she wanted complete authority to design the emergency preparedness program according to her own vision. "I'm not the same person who worked for you 3 years ago," Sarah explained during her final negotiation with Dr. Williams. "I've learned what I'm capable of under the worst possible conditions. I need to work somewhere that recognizes and utilizes those capabilities fully." Dr. Williams agreed to all of Sarah's conditions without hesitation. "Sarah, I don't think you realize how rare it is to find someone with your combination of technical skills, leadership ability, and psychological resilience. We're not just hiring you. We're building an entire program around what you've learned to do." As Sarah prepared to leave the earthquake zone and return to the United States, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 3 years ago, she had been a broken woman who couldn't imagine a future without the husband who had abandoned her. Now she was a leader in international emergency medicine with job offers from organizations around the world. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. It had required her to face her deepest fears, acknowledge her own role in her failed marriage, and rebuild her identity from scratch. But every difficult step had been worth it because it had led her to discover who she really was when she stopped trying to be what other people expected. Sarah was no longer the forgotten woman left behind by someone who couldn't see her value. She had become someone whose work was making a difference in the world, whose skills were in demand, and whose future was filled with possibilities she was excited to explore. 2 years after returning to work with Dr. Williams, Sarah had transformed the hospital's emergency preparedness program into a nationally recognized model. Her training protocols were being used by medical facilities across the country, and she regularly received requests to consult on disaster response planning from organizations around the world. The program Sarah built went far beyond traditional medical training. She had created a comprehensive approach that prepared healthcare workers, not just for the technical challenges of emergency medicine, but for the psychological and emotional demands of working in crisis situations. Her personal experience with trauma and recovery had become the foundation for helping others develop resilience. On a Tuesday morning in April, Sarah was conducting a training simulation when she received a call that would test everything she had built. A series of tornadoes had devastated a rural area 3 states away, destroying the regional medical center and leaving thousands of people without access to health care. "Sarah, we need you to lead the emergency medical response," said Director Michael Stevens from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. "The situation is complicated because the local medical infrastructure is completely gone, but there are still people trapped in the affected areas who need immediate care." Within 6 hours, Sarah was on a military transport plane with a team of 12 medical professionals and equipment to establish a field hospital. The flight gave her time to review the situation reports and plan their response. but nothing could have prepared her for the scope of destruction they encountered upon landing. The tornado had carved a path of devastation 15 miles long and half a mile wide. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to piles of debris, the hospital was completely destroyed, and the emergency services building had been flattened. Sarah's team would be the primary medical support for rescue operations, while also treating survivors who were arriving at evacuation centers. "This is worse than anything I saw overseas," said Dr. Kevin Morrison, one of the emergency physicians on Sarah's team. "At least in war zones, there's usually some remaining infrastructure. Here we're starting from absolute zero." But Sarah had learned to see opportunity in destruction. Within hours of arriving, she had organized the medical response using the same principles that had worked in refugee camps and earthquake zones. She established triage areas in the school gymnasium that had survived the storm, set up treatment stations using supplies from her mobile unit, and coordinated with local volunteers to create a communication system that could track patients and resources. The real challenge came when Sarah learned that among the missing was a group of children from a daycare center that had been in the tornado's direct path. The building was destroyed, but search teams believed some children might still be alive in an underground shelter. The problem was that the shelter was partially collapsed, and any survivors would need immediate medical attention that couldn't wait for them to be fully extracted. Sarah volunteered to be lowered into the damaged shelter to provide medical care while rescue workers continued digging. It was dangerous work. The structure could collapse further at any moment, and the space was so confined that only one person could work at a time. "Sarah, I can't officially authorize this," said Fire Chief Robert Taylor, who was coordinating the rescue efforts. "The structural engineers say there's a significant risk of further collapse. If something goes wrong down there, we might not be able to get you out." Sarah looked at the rescue workers preparing their equipment and thought about all the moments in her journey when she had to choose between safety and doing what felt right. "Chief Taylor, 3 years ago I was a woman who couldn't even make decisions about my own life. Now I'm someone who knows that the most important moments require taking calculated risks for things that matter." The descent into the shelter was terrifying. Sarah had to crawl through a space barely wider than her shoulders, carrying medical supplies in a backpack with only a headlamp for light. The air was thick with dust, and she could hear the creaking of damaged support beams above her head. When she reached the main shelter area, Sarah found 4 children, ages 3 to 7, who had been trapped for 18 hours. They were scared, dehydrated, and one little boy had a broken arm, but they were all alive. More importantly, they had been protected by Mrs. Henderson, the daycare director, who had managed to keep them calm and safe despite being injured herself. "Are you an angel?" asked Emma, a 5-year-old girl, when Sarah's headlamp illuminated the space. "No, sweetheart, I'm a nurse," Sarah replied, beginning to assess their conditions. "But I'm here to help you get out of this scary place and back to your families." Sarah spent 4 hours in that cramped, dangerous space, treating the children's injuries, starting IV fluids for dehydration, and keeping them calm while rescue workers expanded the opening above. Mrs. Henderson, despite having a serious head injury, helped Sarah by singing songs and telling stories that kept the children from panicking. When the last child was finally lifted to safety, Sarah emerged from the shelter to find that news crews had arrived and were calling her a hero. But Sarah deflected the attention to the rescue workers, the volunteers, and especially to Mrs. Henderson, who had protected the children at great personal risk. The tornado response operation continued for 2 weeks, with Sarah's team treating hundreds of survivors and coordinating with relief organizations to provide ongoing medical care. The success of their field hospital became a case study in disaster response. But for Sarah, the most meaningful moment came when she received a thank you card from Emma, the little girl who had asked if she was an angel. "Dear Nurse Sarah," the card read in careful kindergarten handwriting, "thank you for finding us in the dark place. Mommy says you were very brave. When I grow up, I want to help people like you do." Reading that card, Sarah realized that her transformation was complete in a way she hadn't expected. She had started this journey trying to rebuild her own life after devastating loss, but somewhere along the way, she had become someone whose life was about helping others rebuild theirs. The final validation of Sarah's journey came 6 months later when she received a call from the International Emergency Medical Corps. They wanted her to lead a new initiative developing global Standards for disaster medical response. The position would involve traveling around the world, working with governments and relief organizations, and training the next generation of emergency medical professionals. Dr. Martinez, said Director General Antonio Silva during their video conference, "Your work has caught the attention of emergency response leaders worldwide. We believe you represent the future of disaster medicine, someone who understands that effective emergency response requires not just medical skills, but the ability to provide hope and leadership when everything seems lost." Sarah had become Dr. Martinez, having completed her advanced degree in emergency medicine through a program designed for working professionals. The broken woman who once lived above a laundromat now had credentials that matched her experience and responsibilities. As Sarah considered this new opportunity, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. The woman who had once defined herself entirely through her relationship with Marcus now had a career that was making a global impact. The person who had felt forgotten and worthless was now someone whose skills were in demand around the world. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had learned that the greatest strength comes not from avoiding life's disasters, but from learning how to transform them into opportunities for growth and service. Her failed marriage had been devastating, but it had also freed her to discover capabilities she never knew she possessed. On the anniversary of her divorce, Sarah was working at a medical conference in Geneva, training doctors from 12 different countries in trauma response protocols. As she stood in front of the international audience, sharing techniques she had developed in some of the most challenging conditions on Earth, Sarah thought about sending a thank you note to Marcus. His betrayal had been the catalyst for the most difficult and rewarding journey of her life. Without that devastating loss, she might never have discovered that she was capable of leading medical missions in war zones, developing international training programs, or crawling into collapsed buildings to save children. Sarah Martinez was no longer the woman who had been left broken and forgotten. She had emerged from behind her own enemy lines, the limitations and fears that had once defined her life, to become someone who helps others find their way back from their darkest moments. Her story had become proof that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can also be the beginning of the best thing you ever become.